Hello students of class 6th B, welcome to your new online classes. This is your biology classes. In the last lecture, we have learned about all the parts of the flower and their functions. Now let us quickly revise them. So the first one is sepals. Sepals are the green parts of the flower which protect the inner parts of a flower at its bud stage. When the flower is in bud stage, they protect the inner part of the flower. Second one is petals, which is attractive and colorful part of the flower. They protect the essential holes of a flower and attract butterflies, bees and insects for pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains. They may also secrete scent and nectar which attract the insects. So the third one is a stigma. Stigma is a disc-like terminal which has a sticky substance for trapping the pollen grains, which traps the pollen grains. Next one is a style. Style is a long, narrow, tube-like structure which holds the stigma on the top high to catch the pollen grains. To catch the pollen grains, it varies in length. The length differs from flower to flower. The next one is ovary. Ovary is the female reproductive part of the flower which protects the ovule. Ovule is the egg which later on grows into the fruit. So the ovary protects the ovule and later on it grows into a fruit. Next one is ovule which develop into seeds. The next one is filament and anther, which are the male reproductive part of the flower. Filament is a long stick-like structure which holds the anther high up, and the anthers are the part which contains pollen grains which help in pollination. Our next topic is types of flowers. There are two types of flowers based on the presence and absence of male or female reproductive parts. Flowers are of mainly two types. Now we know what is a flower, what are the parts of the flower. As we all know, there are two main parts of the flower, female reproductive part and male reproductive part. Based on their presence or absence in flower, there are two types of flower. First one is bisexual flower, second one is unisexual flower. Let me explain in simple words. The flower which contains both the reproductive parts, male and female, is known as bisexual flower, and the flower which either contains male reproductive part or contains female reproductive part is known as unisexual flower. So bisexual flower which possess both the male part and female part, that is androecium and gynoecium, are bisexual flower. Rose and hibiscus are the examples of bisexual flower. Second is unisexual flower which possess either male part, that is androecium, or female part, that is gynoecium, is unisexual flower, and papaya flower is an example of unisexual flower. Our next topic is functions of a flower. We will study what is the function of a flower in a plant. So the main function of a flower is reproduction. How to achieve reproduction? There are two main steps. So the first one is pollination and the second step is fertilization. So a flower serves an important function in plant, that is reproduction. As a reproductive part, it ensures the continuation of a species by the process which is known as reproduction. So the first step for achieving this is pollination and the second step is fertilization. First we will study about pollination. So what is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther, that is the male reproductive part, to the stigma, which is the female reproductive part. Let me read. For the formation of seeds, so that the seeds may be formed, the pollen grains produced in the anther must be transferred to the stigma of the pistil. This whole process of transferring the pollen grains is known as pollination. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to stigma of the same flower, it may be of the same flower if it is bisexual, or another flower of the same type of plant if it is unisexual, is known as pollination. It occurs naturally, it may occur naturally or by means of some external agents such as wind, water and insects. Now the next topic is types of pollination. There are two types of pollination. First one is self-pollination and the second one is cross-pollination. Let me explain in simple words. When the pollination or transfer of pollen grains occur in the same flower or in the different flower of the same plant, it is known as self-pollination. When the transfer of pollen grains occur in different flowers of the different plant, it is known as cross-pollination. First one is self-pollination, when the pollen grains from an anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of same flower. It should be the same flower or another flower of the same plant, and the plant should be the same. It is known as self-pollination. The self-pollination occurs naturally. It occurs naturally. In the first diagram, the pollen grains from the anther are transferred to the stigma of the same flower. This is known as self-pollination. In the second case, there are two flowers, but the pollen grains are transferred from one flower to the another flower of the same plant, and this is also known as self-pollination. So in the first case, the pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma of the same flower, and in the second case the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, and both are known as self pollination, and it occurs naturally. The second type of pollination is cross pollination. In this pollination, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of the one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same type of the plant, and it is known as cross pollination. It occurs through external agents such as wind, water, or air. As we can see in the diagram, there are two types of flower, this and this, and the pollen grains from one plant here, they are transferred to the stigma of another plant. In the same way, the pollen grains of the another plant are transferred to the stigma of first plant, and this type of pollination is known as cross pollination.